We'll start off with introductions of the committee. Myself, I am Jim Gowland. We live northwest of Teeswater, farm northwest of Teeswater. And then I'll start off with my vice chair, please.
Good evening, everyone. Doug Colbert, Vice Chair of the CLC, resident of Teeswater, 2 kids actively involved in the community and have been on the committee for the past 7 years and lived in Teeswater for the past 16.
Let's go around my screen here, George.
George Miller, CLC member, and I've been on the committee about as long as Doug has, and you. Both Don and I are residents of Teeswater.
Les?
Yep, Les Nichols, resident from Formosa, CLC member from the start, I guess, 7 years, whatever it's been. And then I do some farming, crop consulting, etc. Mark?
Mark Getz, Deputy Mayor of South Bruce, live in the Mildmay Ward, and I've been a CLC member for 6 years.
Skip down to Brian.
Brian Knox, living in Formosa, member of the CLC for probably 6 or 7 years, and very interested in what's transpiring.
Allie.
I'm Allie Meyer. I'm the student rep for the CLC, and I think I've been on here for almost 4 years now, so yeah.
And Mayor Bob.
Yeah, Robert Buckland, the mayor of South Bruce, and I've been on the CLC committee ever since it started, and I live in the town of Teeswater.
And then we'll do introductions of our administrative staff, starting off with CEO Martin. Unmute, please, Leanne.
Thank you, Chair Gowland. I'm Leanne Martin, and I'm the Chief Administrative Officer Clerk for the Municipality of South Bruce. And I just want to make comment that I'm really happy to see 65 participants online this evening. That's a great number.
Project Manager Dave.
Good evening, Chair Gowland. I'm project manager.
Vivian.
Good evening, Chair Gowland and committee. My name is Vivian Kennedy, and I'm the Community Liaison Committee Project Coordinator.
Last but not least, Steve.
Thanks, Chair Gowland, and Steve Trevally here, Communications and Public Relations Officer here at the Municipality of South Bruce.
Okay. I believe the only absence we have this evening is Councillor Ben Ireland. It says on the committee. With that, all intros done. Adoption of the agenda. The agenda has been circulated in the package and out in the public domain. Any additions to the agenda? Seeing none, could I have a mover, please, to adopt the agenda? Seconder, moved by George Miller, seconded by Doug Colbert. All those in favor? That carries. Thank you. Pecuniary interest disclosure or conflicts, any this evening? There is at a certain time, it can be declared then as well too. Okay, Vivian, I guess I look for your direction here this evening to get started with our presentations. By request of our community citizens over the last number of months, we have been able to acquire Dr. Gordon Edwards. Dr. Edwards is president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, and this evening Dr. Edwards is going to speak to us about the surface facilities management of DGR. So whenever, Vivian, you want to bring Dr. Edwards online, and I'll welcome him.
Thank you. There he is.
Yep, welcome, Dr. Edwards. Thank you for taking time this evening to do a presentation. First of all, I guess we'll let you do kind of a self-introduction of yourself and also what the responsibilities are of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility as well too. And then you can talk about your information on the surface facilities. So with that, the screen is yours, Dr. Edwards.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this very important process of learning more about the radioactive waste and learning more about the DGR proposal. I graduated from the University of Toronto with a gold medal in mathematics and physics a long time ago, subsequently acquired a PhD in mathematics and have become a nuclear consultant for over 40 years to governmental and non-governmental agencies throughout Canada, including First Nations people and organizations like the Auditor General of Canada and others. I have 30 minutes to talk, so I'm just going to launch right into my presentation if you don't mind. For that, I'm going to have to share my screen. Okay, very good. This is a model of a uranium atom. Uranium is the only element found in nature that can be used to fuel a nuclear reactor or to make an atomic bomb. Plutonium can also be used for these two purposes, but it is not found in nature. It is only created as a byproduct of uranium inside every nuclear reactor. Now, if you look at the picture, you will see the nucleus of the atom at the very center. The nucleus is where the nuclear energy comes from. In fact, we didn't know that nuclear energy existed until about 120 years ago. So it's a newcomer to our consciousness. And in the process of using uranium, we can unleash the tremendous forces that bind the nucleus together, which, by the way, are the strongest forces known in the universe. This is a monument to the splitting of the uranium atom. It's from the Soviet Union in Soviet days. And when the uranium atom is split with using a thing called a neutron, enormous energy is released. That's indicated by those semicircles. But you have broken pieces of uranium atoms. And these broken pieces of uranium atoms, there are hundreds of varieties, and they constitute the bulk of the radioactive waste. They are very unstable atoms, and consequently they disintegrate or explode, giving off what is called atomic radiation, which can be very harmful to living things and also even to non-living materials. So what is radioactivity? A radioactive nucleus, unlike a normal nucleus, is unstable, and it will explode suddenly and violently without warning. And when that happens, I'm just going to try and clear my screen of the images at the side. I don't know, how do I do that? Ah, yes, I see, okay. When that happens, we get projectiles given off, and these projectiles is what we call atomic radiation. There's a very penetrating form of energy called gamma rays, which are more penetrating and more powerful than X-rays. And there's also less penetrating particles called alpha or beta particles, which are given off by radioactive materials. And all of these are damaging to nearby cells, and they can trigger things like cancer, damage to the reproductive cells, and a host of other illnesses, including death if the exposure is very intense. Now, this is an industry ad. It's called Small Wonder, and the actor is holding a simulated uranium fuel pellet. And basically the message is, isn't it amazing how much energy is contained in such a tiny thing? The energy in this little pellet would be equivalent to a ton of coal, and yet it will not release it will not release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and consequently will not contribute to global warming. So these are two really strong assets of nuclear power. The fact that the energy is so concentrated, and the fact that because it doesn't involve combustion, it doesn't produce greenhouse gases. At the same time, it's important to realize that once that fuel pellet has been used to produce energy, it cannot be just thrown away. In fact, you have to keep your eye on it for the next 10 million years. It has become high-level radioactive waste. And these fuel bundles in front of the gentleman, can-do fuel bundles, they are harmless to handle before they go into the reactor, because uranium only gives off non-penetrating radiation, which doesn't even go through the metal coating of the fuel bundle. However, inside the reactor, the uranium atoms are split,
and we get an accumulation of very radioactive fission products, which are so intense that one of these fuel bundles would kill any human being in 20 seconds once it comes out of the reactor at a distance of 1 meter without proper shielding. Consequently, the used fuel is millions of times more radioactive than the fresh fuel and can never be handled by human hands again. It's only going to be handled by robotic equipment. Now here is a picture of a spent fuel pool under construction at Darlington. The used fuel is so radioactive that it continues to generate heat, and it must be cooled for at least 10 years and often longer in a deep pool of water, circulating water. It's not that the fuel itself is so very hot, but it is generating heat. And if you don't remove that heat as quickly as it is being produced, then the temperature will go up and the fuel will damage itself, and that will release fission products out of the fuel bundle because of the damage. And so you will get releases into the environment of the plant and possibly into the outside environment. So that's why we have to cool it so carefully for the first several years. Now, after 10 or 20 years of cooling, we can move the fuel into a dry storage cask. This is a drawing of a Pickering dry storage cask. And these casks have to be loaded underwater. The cask itself is put underwater and the fuel is loaded into the top of it before the lid is put on, because otherwise the radioactivity would be so intense and the heat generation is still considerable. For safety's sake, it is done underwater. Now, the cask itself weighs 60 tons when it's empty, whereas the used fuel inside it only weighs 10 tons. And the reason the cask is so heavy is because it's trying to block the penetrating radiation from the fission products and the other materials which are heavier than uranium, namely plutonium. But most of the penetrating radiation comes from the fission products. And even though this cask is so heavy, nevertheless, there still is some radiation that comes out to the surface. It still generates heat, and sometimes the heat can develop, sometimes the temperature inside a flask can raise to over 200 degrees, but it will never be more than 250 degrees inside. That's 250 degrees Celsius. And it gradually cools off over the years. It is welded shut at the top, and you'll notice the safeguard seal. The safeguard seal is for international inspection because this irradiated fuel also contains 40 kilograms of plutonium. Now, plutonium is the stuff that can be used to make atomic bombs, and it has to be very carefully watched. So that safeguard seal tells international inspectors that nobody has tampered with this container. Nobody has tried to get a hold of that plutonium. Because that plutonium would be enough to make about 6 or 7 atomic bombs. Now, the irradiated nuclear fuel is then transferred for transportation into a container that is designed for that purpose. And you will notice that the transport container is much smaller than the dry storage container. And as a result of that, the cab of the truck is lead shielded in order to protect the driver against penetrating radiation. Also, there is a bed on board the truck for an alternate driver in the case of long distance hauls from New Brunswick or Quebec, bringing radioactive spent fuel or used fuel to such a place as Cheesewater, for example, because they don't want to have to stop along the way and unnecessarily irradiate people in the vicinity. There is, in fact, radiation that leaks out, and some of the radiation is calculated depending upon whether a car is traveling in the same direction as the truck, in the opposite direction of the truck, or just simply is beside the truck as it passes, or whether it's being exposed, people are being exposed when the truck is stopped, for example, for refueling or for any kind of rest. They try to avoid that as much as possible because they don't want to unnecessarily expose people. There would be about 635 of these shipments per year for a period of 30 to 60 years. So we're talking about a considerable traffic. Now, in the case of Cheesewater, because you're so close to Bruce, that would reduce the number of shipments because the Bruce spent fuel, it would cut it more or less in half. So you have all these different plants that would be sending the radiated fuel to the DGR, the centralized facility. We can cancel those new builds because we're not building any new reactors, at least not any large new reactors in Canada. In fact, there has been no new CANDU reactor ordered since 1978. So we've had a very long dry spell in terms of orders for CANDU reactors in this country. And a lot of people are saying, even in the industry, that there won't be any more large reactors built in North America probably for the foreseeable future. Now, once we get the fuel on site, then we have to have a used fuel packaging plant, because this stuff just doesn't come here and then get buried directly. It has to be transferred. It has to be unloaded. The used fuel has to be taken out of the transport containers, and then they have to be repackaged into long-lived, corrosion-resistant used fuel containers designed to go underground. And so the fuel bundles will be transferred using remote-controlled equipment in protected areas called hot cells. Now, this is the kind of representation of a hot cell that's given by SNC-Lavalin in their 2011 report talking about all of this fuel handling that is going to be necessary. But this is what a real fuel cell looks like. A hot cell is really quite a sophisticated plant, very impressive, in fact. These are actual hot cells at Argonne Nuclear Laboratories in the USA. They are very expensive and sophisticated with human-controlled robot arms. They have 6 feet of leaded glass, these particular ones. That's probably thicker than what the NWMO would have. But they need that thick glass with lead inside it and mineral oil between to allow for transparency, so that the workers will not be overdosed by penetrating radiation. Now, the size of the handling facility, the hot cell repackaging facility, according to the SNC-Lavalin report that I mentioned, would be about 3/4 the size, about 75% of the size of the Bruce dry storage container operation, the building at Bruce that holds all the dry storage containers for stored used fuel. The plant that would be needed at the DGR site or near the DGR site would be processing more than 300 bundles per day for 30 to 60 years. And those bundles would basically be processed pretty much one at a time using those hot cells. So you can see they're going to be very, very busy for a long time. And the size of the plant there would be about 3/4 the size of the existing building. In these hot cells, the windows in this case have 6 panes of 6-inch thick leaded glass with mineral oil filling the gaps to provide optical transparency. You'd have to inquire to find out exactly what configuration NWMO has in mind for their hot cells, but those would be a feature of any DGR. And here we have the thickness of copper coating at 3 millimeters. The containers that they're thinking of putting underground are made of steel coated with copper. Now, it's only a fairly thin coating of copper, only 3 millimeters. That's pretty thin compared with what they're planning in Europe, which is 50 millimeters. So it's much thicker, much thicker. In fact, in Sweden, they're planning to use a total of 300,000 tons of copper in their waste disposal program. But here we're using quite a lot less. And there are 48 used fuel bundles in each copper steel container. That has to be put in by remote control, and it's not as easy as you might think, because the fuel bundles, remember, they're quite old. They've been sitting in those dry storage containers for 50 years or so, and they are embrittled, they are old, they might suffer from a certain degree of corrosion, they may have some mechanical damage, and for sure they are distorted. These fuel bundles are not exactly the same geometry when they come out of the reactor as when they go into the reactor. The rods have bent, and so you have bowing, and the danger is that as you try and put them into a tight space like this, you can damage them. And fuel damage is a real problem. Because here's what happens in a CANDU reactor. In a CANDU reactor, we have all the uranium fuel is in the core of the reactor, which is in yellow there, and the red pipes are the primary cooling system. Now, all of the fission products and the plutonium are produced inside the uranium pellets, inside the uranium fuel bundles. So you would think, therefore, that something like the steam generator, which is basically a boiler there, should not be radioactive at all, because it's very far removed from the core of the reactor. Why would it be radioactive? But the problem is that any kind of damage to the fuel, and there always is a certain amount of damage or defects, there are little pinholes or little cracks or little defects that might have been there from manufacturing or that developed during their time in the reactor core, subjected to a lot of abuse. Consequently, radioactive materials escape from the fuel and contaminate all of the piping through the primary cooling system. These also become radioactive waste, therefore. Now, here's an example of a steam generator from Bruce. They have 8 of these in each reactor at Bruce. Each one is 100 tons in weight, approximately, and you can see the size of it. And altogether, there will be 128 of these steam generators at the end of lifetime of the Bruce reactors, 8 times 8, and then times 2 because they're being refurbished. And when they refurbish them, they replace the steam generators. So there's going to be 128 of these steam generators just from Bruce alone. And those are going to become radioactive waste. So they're going to have to be stored somewhere. Right now, there's no place where they have they don't have a repository for these wastes. As you know, OPG wanted to cite a repository and was forbidden from doing so because of the lack of consent from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. I understand that this particular proposal for DGR at Teeswater would also be on that same unceded territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. So I presume that their consent would also be required for that. Now, you might think that there wouldn't be much radioactivity in these steam generators because they're so far away from the core of the reactor, but here's a list, and this is only a partial list, of radioactive material in the pipes of the steam generators. This is produced by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in one of their public hearings that I participated in. And most of the materials listed there, in fact, almost all of them, I can't see any that aren't, all of the materials listed there are coming from inside the fuel bundles. So you see, there are materials leaking all the time from these fuel bundles, and they come into the pipes, and the pipes get contaminated, and as a consequence, the steam generators become radioactive waste, and they have to be treated as such. Now, there was an unfortunate incident when 500 workers were contaminated by plutonium dust as they were refurbishing one of the Bruce reactors back in 2009, and they were breathing in this plutonium dust for a period of almost 3 weeks. And because plutonium only gives off non-penetrating alpha radiation, it was not detected by the radiation monitors until 3 weeks after the event. And the result was that approximately 500 workers are carrying around a certain small amount of plutonium in their lungs, and it'll be with them for the rest of their lives. So radioactive contamination is insidious, and it's pretty difficult to avoid. As I say, any kind of damage to the fuel will release radioactive materials. Here's an example from my province of Quebec. The Gentil 2 reactor, which has now been shut down, they listed during hearings, they had public hearings on the dry storage of used fuel, and they listed 42 radionuclides that are routinely emitted from the plant into the water and also into the air. And you'll notice that there are plutonium isotopes down there, 4 isotopes of plutonium. I drew a little rectangle around it. Almost all of those materials, except the first 2, tritium and carbon-14, those do not come from the fuel. But all of the other materials, with the exception maybe of cobalt-60 as well, all the other materials come from inside the spent fuel. So these fuel bundles, you may think of them as being intact, but they're not really intact. And they've suffered a lot of abuse and they have been distorted, and sometimes they could even actually fall apart. They could disassemble because they have been weakened to such a point that they can no longer hold themselves together in the geometrical configuration. Any kind of damage of that kind does release radioactive materials. Now, when radioactive materials get out, it's important to realize that these are materials. They're not just invisible rays. They're actually chemical substances whose atoms are unstable. And so these unstable atoms find their way into the food chain, they find their way into the water, they find their way into the body, and they lodge in certain organs depending upon their chemistry. And once they're there, because they're radioactive, they then damage the cells, and sometimes that damage can result in harmful effects to the person. Oftentimes it doesn't result in harmful effects, but over a long period of time with chronic exposure, we found that there's no indication that there's a safe level that you can be sure that you're not going to get an increase in cancer or other problems, medical problems. Now, one particular element that you've probably heard about is radioactive iodine. Radioactive iodine does not exist in nature. We have iodine existing in nature, but it's not radioactive. Radioactive iodine is only created inside a nuclear bomb or a nuclear reactor. And when the radioactive iodine gets out, it goes to the thyroid gland in a human being. In fact, it concentrates in milk, cow's milk in particular, and children who drink that milk then have radioactive iodine concentrating in their thyroid gland. And for example, after the Chernobyl accident, there were 5,000 children in Belarus who had to have their thyroid surgically removed because of damage due to this iodine-131. Now, iodine-131 has a short half-life, only 8 days, so it's all gone by the time the used fuel comes to Teeswater or anywhere else. But there's another isotope of iodine, radioactive iodine, called iodine-129, and that's still there. And so that can, in fact, escape. And when it escapes as a vapor. And that vapor condenses onto the grass, and it does enter into the cow's milk, and that can be a problem. Any radioactive iodine in milk is always going to be a problem. Even if it's very small, it can cause certain stigma and can damage the dairy industry, for example. And that's only one of many radioactive isotopes that could be released. Another one is strontium-90. Strontium-90, again, there is no such thing as radioactive strontium in nature. It's only produced inside nuclear reactors. And that's true of most of these radioactive materials. They're created solely inside nuclear reactors. They're not created, they don't exist in nature for the most part. Now, strontium-90 is a chemical relative of calcium, so it goes to the bones, the teeth, and mother's milk, and of course also cow's milk for that reason too. And when it lodges in the bones, it stays there, and over a period of years, because it continually gives off atomic radiation, it has a half-life of 28 years, so it's there for a long, long time. And it can cause bone cancer and leukemia and other forms of blood cancers, blood damage. Now, I want to turn your attention away from that very real problem of radioactive releases, radioactive contamination, to the problem of plutonium. Plutonium is a very dangerous material for two reasons. One is because it can be used to make atomic bombs, and this picture shows the exact size of the plutonium ball that was used as a nuclear explosive in the Nagasaki bomb. It's only 6.2 kilograms of plutonium. It's very dense, and so it's quite heavy. But that's enough to destroy a city. And if you look at how many bombs are represented in the CANDU used fuel, you see that the present inventory of CANDU used fuel, according to NWMO, is more than 50,000 tons. The amount of plutonium in the CANDU used fuel would be about 200 tons, therefore. It's less than 1/2 of 1%. It's about 0.4%, 200 tons. Now, today, that amount of plutonium would be enough to make 32,000 atomic bombs. So you can see why they have those safeguard seals and so on. As a matter of fact, when you build a hot cells are not commonly used at all in the Canadian nuclear industry. When they build a hot cell for the used fuel, there will be international inspectors coming to see what's going on, because a hot cell is something that can be used to get the plutonium out of the spent fuel, and they don't want They don't want that to happen, so they have to keep an eye on it. Even after 24,000 years, because that's the half-life of plutonium, even after 24,000 years, there would still be 100 tons of plutonium, and that's enough for 16,000 bombs. And then if you double that again, you get to 48,000 years, there'd still be 50 tons, enough for 8,000 bombs. And even after 96,000 years, there would be enough for 2,000 atomic bombs. So you can see why many people think that it's really not possible to forget this stuff. You really can't turn your back on it. And just burying it underground is not really good enough, because anybody who comes along later, 1,000 years later, can see that there was something buried there. And if they dig down, they're going to come across this used fuel. And if they know what they're doing, they'll know that you can have plutonium there, which can be used to make a very powerful arsenal of doomsday weapons. So it's really problematic if you think about just burying this stuff and forgetting it. Now, plutonium is also dangerous in another way. It's a very dangerous radioactive poison. According to the Flowers report, Flowers was a British nuclear physicist who wrote the UK Royal Commission report on nuclear energy and the environment, published in 1976. He pointed out that a few thousandths of a gram of plutonium, when inhaled into the lungs, will cause death in a few weeks due to massive fibrosis of the lungs. It means the scar tissue builds up and you basically suffocate to death. At the same time, 1,000 times less, a few millionths of grams of plutonium, much smaller, if inhaled, will cause lung cancer 20 or 30 years after exposure. So it's a very dangerous material. And because plutonium is handled in the weapons industry, they have set a maximum permissible exposure for an atomic worker, and it's only 0.7 of 1 millionth of a gram. That's how much is allowed as a body burden in an atomic worker. So with 200 tons of plutonium, you have the ability theoretically, and of course this is just playing with numbers, you have the ability there to overdose 285 trillion workers according to that ratio, 0.7 of 1 millionth of a gram. And if you wait 10 half-lives, that's 240,000 years, that's 10 times the half-life, then you reduce the amount by a factor of 1,000. And so you go from 285 trillion to 285 billion, and so on and so on. And so you can understand that the toxicity of this material is extraordinary. And consequently, that's another reason why one has to be very cautious about what we're doing with it and whether it makes sense to actually abandon this material, to plan to abandon it. There's another reason for moving the waste as well, however, and that is in other countries such as England, France, Russia, India, Japan, and of course the United States for their weapons program, used nuclear fuel has been reprocessed by dissolving the solid irradiated fuel into a liquid form and then chemically separating the plutonium. This is called plutonium extraction, and it goes by the name of reprocessing. Now, the result in these places where it has been carried out on a large scale, the result has been hundreds of tanks holding millions of gallons of high-level liquid radioactive waste. That radioactive waste is basically the same stuff that's in these used fuel bundles, but now it's in a liquid form. And these sites all have a great deal of radioactive pollution, which is quite permanent. So there's a danger and an opportunity connected with plutonium. The danger is that plutonium threatens global annihilation. It's the stuff out of which atomic bombs are made, and so we have to be very, very careful. And by the way, it doesn't exist in nature. We create it inside the nuclear reactors. So all the uranium, all the plutonium that we can find on Earth is stuff that we have made ourselves. But there's also an opportunity. The plutonium can be used as a nuclear fuel. And in fact, the Canadian nuclear industry has long advocated that we should not really just bury this used fuel because it has an awful lot of energy potential, namely the plutonium. And for example, John Foster, president of the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, said way back in 1978, plutonium is an extremely useful material and we will be dealing in it. I have not said much about waste disposal. It's extremely important, but it is only part of the fuel cycle program. Now, what he's saying here is that burying the waste is perhaps a good thing to do. It's debatable. But burying the plutonium is not a good thing to do. He's saying we have to get the plutonium out before we bury the waste. That would be much more dangerous than just using hot cells, because it would involve really damaging the fuel. It would mean you have to turn the fuel into a liquid in order to be able to get the plutonium out of there. That's called a reprocessing plant. Right now, it's considered to be too expensive to be affordable. But you can be sure that people in the nuclear industry are going to be pushing very hard to extract the plutonium before putting the waste underground. And that means that it would be a surface facility and would threaten to pose a lot of contamination problems for the area. Jeremy Whitlock, this is a very top physicist from Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, who now works with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. In 2005, he was speaking at an NWMO CLC meeting. He said, what's even more exciting is the prospect of recycling used nuclear fuel to extract some of the 99% remaining energy potential that it retains after leaving the reactor. The potential for future societies to elect to pursue this route has been entrenched in the proposed program of Canada's Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Now, you may not be aware of this, but in all the documentation that NWMO has produced, it always leaves the door open for plutonium extraction or reprocessing. Now, in 2008, 3 years after Jeremy Whitlock made that statement, Cameco, the Cameco Corporation, one of the largest uranium companies in the world, had a huge mural painted on the walls of the Saskatoon airport. And it winds around and it talks about what happens to uranium, how it fuels industry, how it helps medicine with radioisotope. And when the last panel comes up, it talks about reprocessing and storage as being partners in the final use of the used fuel. So the final panel reinforces the view that nuclear waste disposal must also involve the extraction of plutonium. Here's the actual text. Reprocessing and storage are the final stages of the nuclear fuel cycle. Uranium fuel bundles still hold tremendous potential energy when removed from a reactor and can be reprocessed to recover it. So it's important for all citizens, especially citizens who are considering volunteering to be a willing host community for used fuel, to bear in mind that they may be actually saying yes to something that they didn't know they were saying yes to, namely a reprocessing plant. Spent fuel reprocessing, in fact, by the way, you can also read what the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning said in 1978. They had weeks of hearings and testimony and cross-examination on the subject of plutonium and reprocessing way back in 1977-78, and they came to the conclusion that spent fuel reprocessing should not be part of Ontario Hydro's planning. Hence, there's no need for a central interim storage facility for spent fuel. All spent fuel should be stored at nuclear generating station sites. We believe that a central facility would presuppose the reprocessing of spent fuel. It would also involve more transportation and social and environmental problems. In other words, what they're saying here is that with all the expenditure, with building all these hot cells, with building all these transport casks, with building all these underground casks, the storage containers, it's going to be very, very expensive. And the industry is going to say, wait a minute, don't you think we should recover some of the expense by using plutonium as a commodity? In other words, extracting the plutonium would perhaps help to pay the cost of this very expensive procedure. Otherwise, what's the point of moving it to a central location? And that's basically what the Porter Commission report is saying. Now, they also have a front cover on their report, which was published in 1978, called A Race Against Time. And they indicate here in cartoon form the mining of the uranium ore, the processing of the uranium ore, the burning of the uranium in the nuclear reactors to produce electricity, and then this giant question mark, because they think that there are really serious questions that our society has to face, and that it's not obviously the case that we should be just burying it underground or reprocessing it without very seriously thinking about the consequences. They also produced this graph in the 1978 study showing the toxicity of spent fuel, used CANDU fuel, for a period of 10 million years. The axis at the bottom goes up to 10 million years. And by the way, you might notice that after approximately 100,000 years, the toxicity actually goes up again. It goes down, 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 down for the first 100,000 years, and then it goes back up again, and it stays at a fairly high level for millions of years afterwards. That's the total high-level radioactive waste. So just to summarize, I'd like to wrap this up with a few more observations. There are basically, as I see it, 3 stages to the nuclear waste question in Canada and also in the world. Stage 1 was largely a question of denial. From 1945 to 1975, all we heard about nuclear energy is that it's clean. And to most people, including most decision makers, the people who authorized the spending of billions of dollars to build nuclear plants, they thought there is no problem with nuclear energy because it is clean. But as we saw in 1978, around the mid-1970s, it became clear that there's a serious problem with this radioactive waste. And at that point, the industry said, yes, the radioactive waste. Well, yes, but we have a perfect solution. We can just bury it and forget it. Well, the question is, they hadn't broken any ground. They hadn't done any scientific studies at that time. And many people believe that although it may or may not be the best thing to do or one option for handling the waste, you can't scientifically prove that it's a safe thing to do. There's too many uncertainties. And in fact, science is still in its infancy with regard to geology. We've only, up until nuclear waste came along, geology was only a descriptive science, not a predictive science. You don't predict things with accuracy in geology. You only describe what has happened in the past. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen in the future. And you can't get spent fuel or used fuel into an undisturbed geological formation without disturbing it. So the very fact of putting the waste down there means you're disturbing it. Now, since then, since about 2010, a new realism has set in, and more nuclear industry people and policy people are saying, you know what, we can't afford to forget it. This idea of burying it and forgetting it is wrong. We have to inform future generations about the legacy we're leaving them. We can't just ignore the fact that there's still material there that can be used to build atomic bombs. We can't ignore the fact that there's still material there that can harm the health of literally millions or billions of people. And consequently, we really can't afford to forget it. We have to document it. And in fact, nowadays, they're even saying that we have to think more about monitoring and retrievability, keeping it retrievable, so that if things start to go wrong, humans can intervene and set things right again. We can repackage the waste. We can clean up the contamination before it spreads too far into the environment. So here are some questions that we should ask ourselves. First of all, how do we tell future generations about the radioactive legacy we are leaving them? And that has to be done before the stuff is buried. Secondly, how do we safeguard plutonium from bomb makers and profiteers for thousands of years? Remember, the energy content would also make it a valuable target. How do we prepare for new unorthodox nuclear fuel waste from small modular nuclear reactors? These are not new reactors, and the fuel that comes from these small modular reactors is going to be completely different from the fuel that they're talking about right now for NWMO. And lastly, how do we deal with all the long-lived radioactive waste from dismantling old nuclear reactors? All that radioactive rubble, thousands of truckloads, we don't have any place to put it. Is that going to be slotted for the same underground repository, perhaps, as the high-level waste? That remains to be seen. I just wanted to mention here that the small modular reactor fuel is always enriched, unlike CANDU fuel, and this can cause what's called a criticality accident underground. Also, some of this small modular fuel contains corrosive materials like salt, which is not the case with CANDU fuel, and also contains materials like sodium that reacts violently in contact with air and water. Again, unlike Canadian CANDU fuel. So here are the final slide. here are some additional considerations that the host community should consider. Where will the hot cells be located and what radioactive releases may occur? What kind of assurance is there that reprocessing will not take place if the community does not want it? What control does the community have over the kind and quality of used nuclear fuel received? I'm thinking there of the small reactors, for example. What assurances are there that used nuclear fuel will not be imported from other countries? And finally, is it not better to adopt a policy of rolling stewardship in hopes that a more satisfactory solution may be found? These wastes are only 70 years old. Thank you.
I'll start off with any questions from our committee, please. Dr. Edwards. Allie, unmute. Thank you.
So you talked a lot about like all the potential problems that can happen with hot cells and whatever, but with rolling stewardship, would you not have to have hot cells to repackage the nuclear waste that we have currently, because those containers are only licensed for about 50 years currently, so would you not have to continually repackage them and do that in hot cells as well? Like where's the difference there?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. Yes, you would have to repackage them, and you would have to have something with hot cells or pools, one or the other. You could either do it underwater or you could do it in hot cells. But you don't have to cram it into a smaller container like the copper steel containers they wanted to put underground. You can take the fuel from the trays that already exist. You saw them, those trays of fuel that they put in the transport containers. You don't have to remove them from the original containers. You see, the way it is right now, if they want to transport them, they have to have hot cells at every single nuclear plant, as well as another hot cell at the receiving end, at the DGR site. So it would be much less difficult to repackage the fuel if it's done on site where the fuel is stored now into another container of the same kind without having to go through these operations of stuffing it into a much smaller container and manipulating the fuel individually. You don't have to manipulate the fuel individually.
Another question from the committee, please. Brian?
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. You mentioned that the difference between the dry storage container and the transport container. It seems to me that we've all, many of us have gone to OPP and seen these dry storage containers. And I was surprised to find that it was such an elaborate process to move them to a transport container. And it was a question for maybe not yourself, NWMO, is the difference in robustness from the dry storage containers to the transport containers. And it's the first time I have heard about the hot cells. That's an intriguing thought. You mentioned steam generators and that being a high-level waste.
No, I'm sorry if I misled you. I didn't mean to say the steam generators are high-level waste. They're classified as intermediate-level waste. The tube bundle, the tubes that are inside the steam generator, there's thousands of tubes inside, and they're classified as intermediate-level waste. The point I was trying to make there is that people often get the idea that because the fuel bundles are made of metal and because they're intact, nothing gets out of them. And the point of showing about the contamination of steam generators was simply to say, yes, stuff does get out of the fuel, even if the fuel is not badly damaged. Now, if you have severe core damage, then you have a Chernobyl accident or a Fukushima meltdown. But if you just have very, very slight damage, it still spreads contamination far and wide. So my point was simply that handling used fuel is always a dangerous operation.
Mr. Chairman?
Brian, one more, please.
You then mentioned about the radioactive material. I think you called them substances. And I guess that's the first I've heard of them, about these, I think you spoke of names I have not heard of before, strontium, I think, and iodine, radioactive iodine. That's the first I've heard of them. They are created, or they come about from this contamination within the reactor.
Yes, when the uranium atoms are split, there are literally hundreds of different radioactive atoms created as the broken pieces of uranium atoms that have been split. And you might have heard of cesium-137, for example. It's a very deadly material which is caused evacuation of around Fukushima and around Chernobyl. That comes directly from the splitting of the uranium atom. So does the radioactive iodine, so does the radioactive strontium. I will send the committee a link to a list of 211 radioactive materials that are human-made, that are created during the fission process. And that's the stuff that's in the high-level radioactive waste. And those materials, the thing about iodine and cesium and strontium is that they are released more easily because they're released as gases. They're released in the form of vapors. And they can escape much more easily into the environment and enter much more easily into the food chain and so on.
I think I will look to Steve to present a couple of questions here from our audience. I'd just like to also make known that any questions, and I know that we're coming against the 8 o'clock hour here, so we got to get into our next speaker. Any questions that are here will be sent to the presenter, Dr. Edwards, for answers, and they will be posted on the CLC website. So, Steve, if you got, maybe I'll take 2 questions and maybe go back to the last question from the committee, please.
Sure. So I'll read the first one that came in. In 2017, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance released a video interview of yourself, Dr. Edwards, discussing the nuclear waste at Pickering Generating Station. In that video, you say, quote, "The waste needs to be pulled back onto dry land, away from Lake Ontario, in hardened on-site storage," end quote. Many of our local community members believe that waste should remain on the lake rather than in a DGR. If rolling stewardship is your preferred storage method, where would you suggest it be implemented? On the lakeshore at the reactor site or inland at a centralized location?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. That certainly requires clarification. When I said pull it back from the shore, I just meant that it shouldn't be right on the shore. It should be back some distance. I don't mean completely off-site, but within the site itself. For example, at Chalk River, you can move waste back 20 kilometers from the Ottawa River and still be on the same crown land that Chalk River is located on. Now, I'm not sure about the exact configuration of Pickering, but there is land where you can pull that waste away from the shore of the lake and put it into a much more hardened facility. Hardened, by hardened, it means that it will survive earthquakes, it will survive attacks, terrorist attacks or air attacks or things like that. This can be done, but not to actually truck it off-site. They can move these waste casks at Pickering using kind of a tractor device that moves very, very slowly, and it just moves it to a new location on site without going onto the highway, without going onto public roads.
Steve, another question, please. Thank you, Doctor.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Doctor. I'll go on to the next question that came in order from the next another individual. Dr. Edwards, you advocate rolling stewardship, which really means nothing more than what's already being done, conscientiously caring for and monitor the spent fuel. This is only possible as long as there is a strong company like OPG in a stable state like Ontario with a strong regulator like the CNSC. How long do you think that we can count on those conditions? Isn't it safer for all concerned to follow the IAEA guidelines and place the spent fuel in a repository where it does not need to be actively managed?
Thank you for the question. Well, this is very much the heart of the debate, and my opinion is that it is premature to ever think about putting these wastes beyond human control. And the real serious complaint I have about NWMO's proposal is the abandonment part of it. The idea that the last phase is to abandon it. I think that we shouldn't be doing that. I think that we should, it may be, as I said, 70 years ago, these radioactive materials that Brian Knox was asking about did not even exist on Earth. We've only created them in the last 70 years. And we're talking about safeguarding them for the next 10 million years. Well, it seems to me that if in 100 years or so, maybe 200 years or so, we may find a genuine solution to this problem. in the sense that we can find out a way scientifically to actually annihilate these wastes or to neutralize them and render them harmless. It would be a shame to bury them now before we have that opportunity. And I believe that burying the waste is maybe convenient for the industry and maybe convenient for the society, but actually it doesn't solve any problem. As long as you keep running the reactors, there's going to be 50 years worth of waste at the site of the reactors, no matter how quickly you bury it, because NWMO has said they will not even touch any waste that is not 50 years old. So I don't think you're solving the problem. You're spending an awful lot of money on what might be literally a dead-end solution and not really a solution at all.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. One more question from the committee, if there is. Ali, please. We'll wrap up because we have to get on to our next speaker. We're coming up on 8 o'clock.
So then just kind of based on your last little statement there, there's kind of like two questions. First of all, if retrievability is one of the things with NWMO, would you not be able to retrieve it to use it or to neutralize it or do whatever? But more importantly, you're saying that we might come up with some future technology to use it, but that is also untried and untested, and that is the reason you're opposing a DGR, is because it's untried and untested. So what makes that in your mind, a better option to go with something that doesn't exist at this time as opposed to a DGR?
Okay, may I please say that I don't think that the discussion should be focused on one option versus another option. I think the discussion should be focused on what does the community want. And what I'm concerned about is the community may get things, if they accept the NWMO offer to become a willing host community, they may end up with things that they never thought that they were agreeing to. They may end up with a new processing plant. They will end up with hot cells possibly on territory right around the DGR site. They will end up with a lot of traffic for 30 or 60 years of spent fuel coming from all over Canada to the one site. So I think that this is the main point here. The main point is, how does this affect the community? Whether DGR or whether rolling stewardship is the best thing for society at large, I think that's another debate. The most important thing, I think the most important contribution that I might be able to make is just pointing out a few things to the community where they should ask themselves, if we say yes to NWMO's plan, are we then going to have any control over what happens afterwards? Is it a blank check, in other words? Because there's lots more pending than just burying this stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for the great presentation this evening. Certainly, I know that you had a lot of slides there before. You did a lot of cutting back there, and a lot of great information there. And we thank you for taking time this evening to be with us. As I said, the questions that are put forward are posted, and we'll have answers. So Steve and others of the municipality will get those to you. And we look forward to seeing the rest of the answers and the questions and answers that are solicited here tonight. I think it's great that we're able to have you here. So thanks again so much.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate being invited by the committee, and I was asked to limit myself to talking about local surface facilities. But if you would wish to hear from me again on the other questions regarding rolling stewardship and so on, which I only mentioned in passing, then I'd be happy to come back and give a different presentation on that subject. So,
thank you.
Thank you again.
We'll keep that in mind. Thanks so much again. Okay, we need a motion to receive Dr. Edwards' presentation. Moved by Deputy Mark, Ali, seconder. All those in favor? And that carries.